Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to plunge into a story that, honestly, feels like it's ripped from some historical thriller, but it's all very real.
Hmm.
We're exploring the incredible, really complex, and just utterly fascinating life of the Chevalier d'Eon.
What a figure.
Exactly. Imagine this. An 18th century French person, a diplomat, a soldier, a spy, writer, duelist, the list goes on. And their entire public life just became wrapped up in intrigue, conflict, and this lifelong, very public debate about their gender identity.
It's truly a story that challenges how we think about identity, definitely,
Mhm.
but also loyalty and performance, really, in history.
Right.
And for this deep dive, we've, pulled from a stack of sources,
Mhm.
historical accounts, articles from places like Wikipedia, History.com, the Honda Palace blog, the National Archives too, and the Midlands Historical Review. A good range.
Yeah, a solid mix. So our mission here is to unpack these sources, find those key nuggets of knowledge, you could say, and piece together the life of Deon.
Try and make sense of it.
Yeah, highlight the pivotal moments and shed some light on a figure who, well, clearly continues to resonate and spark debate even today. Get ready, because there are some genuinely surprising turns ahead.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. We know Charles Dion de Beaumont was born October 5, 1728, in Tonnerre, France.
Okay.
And yes, his full birth name was quite something. Charles Genevieve Louis Auguste André Timothée Robert Pierre Dion de Beaumont.
Wow. Okay, that name definitely has a certain gravitas, doesn't it? So, what was his early life like? Where did he get his start?
Well, he moved to Paris in 1743, pursued a pretty rigorous education at the prestigious College Mazarin.
Right.
He was clearly academically gifted, graduated in civil law and canon law in 1749, so age 21, and began his career as a lawyer.
But the sources hint that there was maybe a bit more to young Charles than just legal studies.
Oh, absolutely. While law was his profession, he also, well, he excelled in physical pursuits, too. He was an accomplished horseman, but it was really his skill with a sword that quickly made him a name for himself.
Ah, the fencing.
Exactly. The sources describe him as becoming known as one of the first swords of France, relatively early on.
Hmm.
It's quite a combination, isn't it? A lawyer with this, reputation as an elite duelist.
It certainly paints a picture. And he wasn't shy about, entering the public eye either.
No, he wasn't. From about 1753, he started publishing political writings. And these weren't just, obscure pamphlets. They gained notice.
Okay.
And that led to him being appointed a royal censor for history and literature in 1758, which was a significant step, really. Put him in a position to potentially move into more sensitive areas of royal service.
Which is exactly what happened, right? Leading him into that shadowy world of espionage. This is where the story really starts to twist.
Indeed, yeah. Dion was introduced to King Louis the XV's clandestine intelligence network. This wasn't, the official foreign ministry.
Right.
It was Louis the XV's own private spy ring, known as Le Secret du Roi, the king's secret.
The king's.
Their task was, well, basically to gather foreign intelligence and pursue the king's personal, often very covert, foreign policy goals.
And his work for the king's secret took him across Europe.
Yes, the sources mention missions in places like Russia,
Mm-hmm.
involved in schemes related to Poland, where Louis the XV had specific interests. But one of his most significant postings was London.
Okay, London, where he was involved in major diplomatic events, publicly negotiating peace.
Precisely. He was sent there, served as secretary to the ambassador negotiating the Treaty of Paris. That's the one that formally ended the Seven Years' War in 1763.
Big deal treaty.
Huge deal. And his contribution to drafting it was considered so important that he was actually awarded a knighthood. That's where he earned the title Chevalier d'Eon.
Okay, so publicly, he's the Chevalier d'Eon, helping broker peace. But the sources reveal there was this completely separate secret agenda happening at the same time, thanks to his role in Le Secret du Roi.
That's the extraordinary part, really. At the very same time he was publicly working on the peace treaty, d'Eon was also secretly engaged in Louis the XV's personal plan, which was laying the groundwork for a potential invasion of Britain.
Wow. An invasion?
Yeah, this involved making contacts, bribing politicians, gathering intelligence, all to facilitate a future military action against the country he was making peace with.
Think about that actively plotting a potential war while sitting at the negotiation table for a peace treaty. I mean, it speaks volumes about the complexity and just the sheer audacity of Louis the XV's Secret Service
Hmm.
and D'Eon's pivotal sort of dual role in it all.
It was incredibly high stakes.
Sure.
And this kind of double dealing, well, eventually led to major conflict once the treaty was signed.
How so? What happened after the ink was dry?
Well, a new ambassador, the Count of Guerchy, arrived in London in October 1763.
Okay.
And following typical protocol, D'Eon, who'd effectively been running things during the transition, was demoted back to secretary. Yeah, a huge blow to his pride, his ambition. He found it deeply humiliating.
And he didn't just accept that demotion quietly, I'm guessing.
Not at all. He actually disobeyed direct orders to return to France. And instead, he launched some truly explosive accusations against Guerchy, claimed the ambassador had tried to drug him, kidnap him, even murder him.
Whoa, that's a dramatic escalation. What was his strategy then to protect himself and his reputation against the official French line?
Well, in March 1764, in a pretty bold attempt to save his position and discredit Guerchy, D'Eon published this highly sensitive volume of diplomatic correspondence.
Published it.
Published it. The book was titled Lettres, Mémoires et Négociations Particulières du Chevalier D'Eon. I mean, publishing official state papers like that, it was an almost unheard of breach of protocol, caused a massive scandal, publicly disavowing the new ambassador.
But you mentioned he had even more explosive material, like insurance.
Yes, exactly. This is where the insurance comes in. D'Eon held back the most sensitive documents, the king's secret plans for the invasion of Britain. This gave him serious leverage. It made the French government extremely cautious about, pushing him too hard.
So this led to legal battles playing out across the channel, didn't it?
It did. D'Eon sued Guerchy in Britain for attempted murder.
Okay.
In response, Guerchy sued D'Eon for libel back in France. D'Eon chose not to defend himself against that libel charge in France and was formally declared an outlaw there.
Yet, despite being an outlaw from his own country, he found this unexpected public support in Britain. Why was that?
Well, the British government refused to extradite him back to France, for one.
Interesting.
And D'Eon skillfully cultivated public sympathy. He portrayed himself as this sort of victim of royal abuse of power. Some people in Britain even saw parallels between his stand and that of their own radical figure, John Wilkes, who was challenging government authority at the time.
So he became kind of a cause celeb.
A bit, yeah. And this period allowed D'Eon to continue writing and publishing too, including Les Loisirs du Chevalier D'Eon in 1774.
So he's living in London, an outlaw, leveraging his secrets and public support. But then around 1770, the focus of public fascination shifts dramatically, doesn't it? From his political intrigue to something much more personal.
Exactly. That's when rumors began to circulate widely in Britain that the Chevalier D'Eon, despite his, very overtly masculine presentation and reputation as a swordsman, was actually a woman.
I can only imagine the sensation that must have caused.
Oh, it became an absolute public obsession. The sources make it really clear this wasn't just like whispered gossip. It became the subject of widespread wagering across London.
Wagering? You mean betting?
Literally betting, yes.
Yeah.
There was even a pool set up at the London Stock Exchange with people putting down fortunes on D'Eon's sex.
That's astonishing, the scale of public engagement with this question. And how did D'Eon respond to all this speculation? Did they confirm or deny it?
Famously, D'Eon refused to give a clear answer. They wouldn't confirm, wouldn't deny the rumors, and adamantly refused to undergo any kind of physical examination, stating it would be a great dishonor. D'Eon actively played into the mystery, kept the public guessing.
It's interesting to compare this to other historical figures we know of who cross-dressed, like, say, Joan of Arc or Hannah Snow. The sources point out that their instances of wearing men's clothes were often temporary, right, for specific reasons like military service. D'Eon's situation seems to have evolved into something much more complex, kind of intertwined with their identity over the long term.
Precisely. It wasn't just a disguise for a mission anymore. It became part of this protracted public and presumably private negotiation of self.
Speaking of negotiation, how did D'Eon eventually resolve the whole outlaw status and find a way back to France?
Well, when King Louis the XV died in 1774, D'Eon saw an opportunity, a chance to end the exile.
Ah, new king, new chance.
Exactly. He began negotiations with the new king, Louis VI, hoping to finally regain his recognition, his title, his pension, and crucially, return home.
And the famous playwright Pierre de Beaumarchais, the guy who wrote The Marriage of Figaro, he got involved in these negotiations.
He did. Beaumarchais acted as the king's negotiator. And what's fascinating here is that the question of D'Eon's sex became absolutely central to the terms of the deal.
Really? It wasn't just a side issue.
No, it was a core condition for returning to favor.
And the sources mention courtroom testimony being part of this somehow.
Yes, remarkably. As part of these negotiations, and maybe as a means to justify the agreement legally or publicly, witnesses reportedly swore in a courtroom setting that they had seen Dayon and were convinced she was biologically female.
Wow.
Based on this testimony and probably the political necessity for the French crown to just resolve the whole Dion situation, a deal was struck with Louis XVI.
Okay, so what were the specific terms of this deal?
Dion would be allowed to return to France and keep their pension, but they would lose the title of plenipotentiary minister because a woman couldn't hold that rank at the time. And crucially, they were required to adopt female dress and habits and live the remainder of their life publicly as a woman. That was the condition for returning home.
And Dayon accepted. After all these years presenting masculinely, being this renowned duelist.
Yes, Dion accepted the terms, returned to France, began living publicly as a woman, and was, legally recognized as female. Although, it's a fascinating detail from the sources that Dion actually resisted adopting female dress for about 2 years after the agreement was made.
2 years. So there was some pushback there.
Seems like it. Before fully complying with the terms, yeah.
And there was even a published story, right? A kind of authorized explanation for this transformation.
Yeah, a ghostwritten memoir was published in 1779, titled The Military, Political, and Private Life of Mademoiselle Dion.
Mademoiselle Dion.
Exactly. And the narrative presented was essentially that Dion had been born female but raised as a boy by their father, specifically to secure an inheritance property tied to a male heir.
Ah, the inheritance trope.
Right. So now, according to this story, Dion was simply living authentically as the woman she always was, her true self.
So Dion lived the next, 3 decades as Charlotte Dion?
Exactly, for about 33 years. Dion became something of a public figure, even a bit of a celebrity in France, living as a woman.
And remarkably.
And notably,
Yeah.
yes, despite living publicly as a woman, the sources emphasize that she continued to participate in fencing tournaments, often while wearing women's clothing.
That must have been an extraordinary sight, combining the, social expectation of female dress with the very masculine skill of fencing. Was life finally settled for her after returning to France?
Not entirely. That impulse for military service seemed to return. In 1779, she actually attempted to join Lafayette and fight in the American Revolutionary War.
No kidding.
Yeah, reportedly dressing again as a dragoon. However, the royal authorities intervened pretty quickly. She was arrested March 20, 1779, and exiled back to her hometown of Tonnerre.
Oof. Back again. And eventually found her way back to Britain.
Yes, she returned to Paris in 1783, then moved back to Great Britain in 1785. But by this time, her financial situation was, pretty dire.
Yeah.
She'd lost her French pension, times were hard. She was forced to sell her prized library, like 8,000 books. A significant loss for someone who was also a scholar and writer.
That's tough. And it was this poverty that led her back to the fencing cells then.
Precisely. She began participating in public fencing exhibitions, bouts for money, just to survive. This included a really celebrated match requested by the Prince of Wales himself, the future King George IV.
Oh, wow.
Against the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, another renowned fencer. This was at Carlton House, April 9, 1787. And despite wearing the required female dress, Dayon showcased incredible skill, hit Saint-Georges 7 times apparently, and won the match, really reinforcing her reputation as a master fencer.
Fencing for survival well into her later years. That's something.
Yes, she continued these public bouts even into her 60s. Sadly, she suffered a severe injury in one such match in 1796. A foil button broke, resulting in a deep wound in her right arm.
Oh, no. How did she spend her very final years then?
She lived in increasing poverty, especially after her property back in France was confiscated during the French Revolution.
Right, the revolution would have changed everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She did receive a small pension from King George III, which helped somewhat. She apparently became more religious, began writing her memoirs, although they weren't published during her lifetime. She wrote about her life, including the public transformation, describing it as making her a new creature.
A new creature. And the final, perhaps most dramatic chapter of her story came after her death.
It did. The Chevalier, or Chevalier Dion, died in poverty in London on May 21st, 1810, aged 81.
Okay.
Upon her death, her roommate, a Mrs. Cole, was reportedly shocked by something she observed while preparing the body. immediately called for medical professionals.
leading to a post-mortem examination.
Yes, a formal examination was conducted by a surgeon, M. Copeland, on May 23, 1810, witnessed by several others. And the report certified that they found the male organs in every respect perfectly formed.
Ah, so male anatomy.
Yes. However, and this is where it gets particularly interesting for modern interpretation, the report also noted feminine physical characteristics on the body, describing unusual roundness and breasts remarkably full.
So the autopsy report itself contained these, well, seemingly contradictory observations. How did the public and the press react to these findings?
Oh, it caused a major sensation. The press widely reported the autopsy results. Initially, the dominant narrative, perhaps predictably, was that Dayon had been this grand deceiver, a clever con man who had fooled everyone for years.
It's a con man angle.
Yeah, Dayon was buried on May 28, 1810 at St. Pancras Old Church in London, and her name is now inscribed on the Burdett Coutts Memorial there.
So the posthumous discovery added yet another layer to a life already full of twists and turns. Her legacy continues to be debated and interpreted in all sorts of ways, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Dion's story endures precisely because it defies easy answers. As you said, the initial interpretation in the press was often that of a performer, an actor, maybe a con man, motivated by political necessity or personal gain through deception.
But modern perspectives offer different lenses, right? Different ways to view her life.
Yes, exactly. One perspective is that of Dion as, perhaps, a transvestite or crossdresser. This view might see the adoption of female dress primarily as that condition of the deal to return to France,
Right, the legal requirement.
or perhaps as something Dion later embraced or found comfortable despite that initial resistance and clear preference for military uniform. It just highlights the complexity of someone living decades in one presentation after years in another.
And the specific details from that autopsy report the male organs, but also the feminine characteristics that's led to another possibility being discussed.
They have. Some modern interpretations, looking at the surgeon's notes, consider the possibility that Dayon might have had intersex traits.
Ah, interesting.
This shifts the narrative away from just performance or chosen identity, maybe towards a biological factor complicating those simple binary classifications of the time.
And within the context of, evolving understandings of gender identity today, Dayon is often seen as a pretty significant historical figure.
Yeah. Many see Dion as a pioneering figure in what we might now loosely call transgender history, someone who lived outside the strict binary gender norms of their time. I mean, the very term eonism was coined back in the Enlightenment, referring specifically to gender nonconformity, and it came directly from Dion's public presentation and identity.
Her story really underscores the difficulty historians face when trying to interpret gender and identity for figures from the past, doesn't it? It's tough.
It's incredibly challenging. We're working with external accounts, public perception, legal documents, all from an era that had a vastly different understanding of sex and gender than we do today.
Totally different framework.
Exactly. We lack clear insight into Dion's internal sense of self over time. And we're often applying modern terms like transgender, cisgender, gender fluid, non-binary terms that simply didn't exist in the 18th and early 19th centuries to try and make sense of a life lived back then.
And as you mentioned earlier, our scientific understanding of sex itself has evolved too.
Right. Modern science increasingly views biological sex itself as existing more on a spectrum, not just a simple binary. And that perspective further complicates applying rigid historical categories to someone like Dayon. It challenges the idea that we need to find one single cause or neat label to explain why their gender expression deviated from societal norms.
Beyond the fascinating questions of identity, Dayon did leave a tangible legacy as well. Artifacts.
Yes, artifacts like Dayon's fencing sword are preserved. There are also numerous portraits, including one rediscovered fairly recently in 2012, which depict Dayon in female dress. Though, interestingly, contemporary observers sometimes noted features in those portraits they still interpreted as masculine.
And Dayon's remarkable life continues to capture the imagination in popular culture, right?
Absolutely. Dayon has been depicted in various forms of media, film, television, literature. It just proves that this multifaceted story still resonates and fascinates people today.
So we've taken a deep dive into the extraordinary life of the Chevalier, or maybe Chevalier Dayon, a figure who was, well, a soldier, a spy, a diplomat, a duelist, a writer, and whose identity remained the subject of intense speculation and debate for centuries.
It's a life that truly forces us to confront the limits of historical records and how inadequate simple categorizations can be when we try to understand the complexities of human identity, particularly across different eras with such different social norms and understandings.
It really does. I mean, Dion navigated a life that defied easy labels, defied expectations in an era arguably far less understanding of gender complexity than our own.